Imagine waking up one day only to realize you haven't truly made a decision in years. You think you have. You chose your career, your partner, your daily routine. But beneath those choices, there's something else. A quiet, persistent force, guiding your hand. It whispers behind every yes, echoes in every no, and slowly wraps itself around who you think you are. At first, it feels like comfort, like certainty, a ritual, a pattern, a familiar ache that gives your day structure, a drink after work, a scroll through endless screens before bed, the need to be liked, the panic when you're alone. It begins as a response, but eventually, it becomes a requirement, a craving, not just for the substance or behavior, but for the identity that forms around it. You begin to say things like, "That's just how I am," or "I need this to cope," and in those words, you surrender. Not to the thing itself, but to what it represents. A version of you that feels real because it hurts just enough to feel like truth. But what if it's not truth at all? What if your deepest compulsions, your daily rituals, your must-haves are not just habits, but masks? What if addiction is not just about substances or behaviors, but a mirror reflecting a self that never got a chance to be born? Addiction is often painted as a monster hiding in the dark: alcohol, drugs, gambling, pornography, screens. But what if it's more insidious than that? What if addiction hides in your need to be busy, in your obsession with productivity, in your constant need for approval, or the unbearable fear of being forgotten? What if your addiction is simply the shape your pain took to survive? Carl Jung once wrote, "Every form of addiction is bad, no matter whether the narcotic be alcohol, or morphine, or idealism." Let that last word linger. Idealism. Addiction doesn't always show up as excess. Sometimes it disguises itself as virtue, perfectionism, self-sacrifice, ambition. But underneath it all, it's the same hunger to escape. Escape what? The void. The ache. The silence when the world stops spinning and you're left with nothing but yourself. The self you don't recognize. The self you've been avoiding your entire life. And so you keep feeding it. Not because it makes you feel good, but because it makes you feel familiar. You begin to build a home inside your hunger. You decorate it with habits, justify it with logic, protect it with shame. Eventually, you stop saying, "I have an addiction." Instead, you start saying, "I am this." And that's the moment it wins. Not when you crave it, not when you fall back into it, but when you start calling it you. This is the true power of addiction. Not its chemical grip, but its psychological seduction. It convinces you that you need it to be someone, that without it, you would unravel into nothing, that your grief, your trauma, your loneliness would flood you without this dam you've built. But here's the paradox. The longer you live this way, the less alive you feel. You begin to forget what real desire feels like, what unfiltered emotion sounds like. You forget how to want something without needing it to numb you. And slowly, you begin to erode. Not all at once, but in small, silent ways, through the eyes you avoid in the mirror, through the dreams you no longer chase, through the people who once knew the real you, but don't anymore. So here's the great question, the one most never dare to ask. Who are you when your addictions fall silent? Who is left when the noise is gone, when the rituals are broken, when the temporary gods you worship, comfort, validation, control, stop answering your prayers? And more importantly, do you actually want to meet that version of yourself? What if you've been so entangled with your addiction that to lose it would feel like a death? Not of your habit, but of your entire identity? And if that's true, if addiction becomes identity, then what does it truly mean to heal? Because to heal, you would not only have to stop doing the thing, you would have to stop being the person. Who needs it? Are you ready for that? Or have you fallen so in love with your own pain that you've mistaken it for who you are? This isn't about willpower, it's about awakening. And to awaken is to risk everything you've built, especially the things that kept you safe. But perhaps, just perhaps, those things you called safe were only prisons with pretty walls, and maybe, just maybe, you've been calling the bars your bones. Let's go deeper. There's a peculiar tragedy in the way addiction begins, not as a monster, but as a protector. It waits at the edges of your pain, offering relief. A soft, numbing lullaby when reality cuts too deeply, a coping mechanism, a survival tool, and in that moment, when the pain is unbearable and nothing else seems to work, it helps. That's the cruel elegance of it. It works, until it doesn't. You never meant to become attached. You were just trying to survive. But somewhere along the way, the coping mechanism became a cage. And like a prisoner kept too long in the dark, you forgot there was ever a world beyond it. To understand how addiction becomes identity, you must first understand what the addiction is protecting you from. And that takes us far deeper than the act itself. It takes us into the shadow. Carl Jung believed that every person carries a shadow, the part of the psyche made up of everything we reject, repress, or disown. It is formed in childhood, in those moments when your true impulses clashed with what the world deemed acceptable. Maybe you were too sensitive, too wild, too needy, too angry, too loud, or simply too you, so you buried those parts, not because you wanted to, but because your survival depended on it. The child learns early that to be loved, parts of them must die, but the psyche never forgets. And what we suppress doesn't disappear, it festers. It grows twisted in the dark, hungry to be seen again. Yet when those old needs, wounds, and feelings rise to the surface, they terrify us. They threaten the carefully constructed identity we've created to avoid pain. This is where addiction steps in. Addiction is the ritual you build to silence the shadow. It becomes the translator between your unconscious suffering and your conscious life. But it speaks in hunger, in impulse, in shame. And that's where things become dangerous, because the longer you use addiction to manage your shadow, the more it fuses with your sense of self. The line between what you do and who you are begins to blur. At first you say, I drink to cope. Then, I am a drinker. Eventually, this is just who I am. And now the shadow has won, not by raging, not by destroying, but by being, ignored for so long that it had no choice but to become you. The existentialists warned us about this long before modern neuroscience confirmed it. Jean-Paul Sartre spoke of bad faith, the act of lying to oneself to avoid the discomfort of true freedom. In other words, we create false selves to escape the unbearable responsibility of choosing who we become. We say we have to act a certain way, that we're trapped by our past, our genetics, our trauma. But Sartre saw through this illusion. To be human is to be condemned to be free. And freedom, when faced with unhealed wounds, can feel like terror. Addiction offers an escape from that terror, a structure, a false certainty. It's not just about dopamine or pleasure, it's about identity preservation. Because to heal would require you to change. And change threatens the fragile ego structure you've spent your entire life building. So what does the ego do? It protects you. Fiercely. Even if that means protecting your suffering. Schopenhauer once said, "Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." The desire itself feels unchosen, automatic. That's because desire isn't born in the conscious mind. It emerges from the depths of the unconscious, from wounds we've never looked at directly. You don't just crave the drink. You crave what the drink means: relief, disconnection, permission to feel or not feel. You don't just crave validation. You crave a self that finally feels real, if only for a moment. But here's the problem. Every time you act out that addiction, you reinforce the very identity that created the craving. It's a feedback loop, a psychic Mobius strip, and like all unconscious patterns, it thrives in secrecy. Modern psychology gives this a name: self-schema reinforcement. The idea that your repeated behaviors and thoughts form a mental template, a self-concept that your brain then works to preserve, even if it causes suffering. You literally become neurologically biased toward acting in ways that prove the identity you've unconsciously chosen. So if you've come to believe, "I'm a failure," or "I need this to feel okay," your mind will unconsciously seek situations, thoughts, and feelings that support that belief. This is why addiction is not just about what you consume. It's about what you believe about yourself in the process. It's why people can get clean from substances and still feel trapped, because the identity remains. The shame remains. The idea that "this is who I am" lingers long after the behavior ends. In this way, addiction is a myth you keep telling yourself, a story so rehearsed, so repeated that you forgot it was fiction. You perform the character every day, until it becomes indistinguishable from your soul. But your soul is not your performance. Your soul is what's buried beneath the performance. It's what aches behind the craving. It's the scream locked behind the silence of your daily rituals. And the tragedy is not that you became addicted. The tragedy is that you began to believe it was the only version of you that could survive. So when you ask, "Why can't I stop?" understand that it's not just the addiction pulling you back, it's the identity you've built around it. It's the fear that if you shed this skin, there will be nothing left underneath. But what if that fear is lying? What if underneath your compulsions and your coping mechanisms, there is someone you've never met? And what if that person has been waiting, not to be saved, but to be remembered? Let's pull the curtain back even further. You've seen how addiction forms. Now, you need to see what it costs you, quietly, daily, invisibly. It happens in silence. Addiction rarely announces itself with drama. It doesn't always come crashing in with broken bottles or overdoses or rehab. Sometimes it slips in through the smallest crack: a slight twinge of anxiety when your routine is disrupted, a low-grade panic when your phone dies, a compulsive need to fill the silence with noise. You don't even notice it at first, but something inside you begins to shift. You no longer know how to sit still without reaching for something. Coffee, cigarettes, another tab open, another dopamine hit. You tell yourself it's harmless, normal, just a way to unwind. But over time, your capacity for stillness, presence, and depth begins to rot, quietly, invisibly, and that is the first cost. Not your health, not your relationships, not your bank account, but your ability to be with yourself. The more you feed the addiction, the more intolerable your own presence becomes. Until one day, you can't sit alone in a room without distraction. You need something, anything, to fill the void. And in that moment, you lose something sacred: your intimacy with your own being. This is where addiction turns from habit to identity. Because now, the act is no longer just something you do. It's something you require to function, to exist. You begin filtering the world through the lens of the addiction. Every social setting, every task, every relationship becomes an obstacle to the craving or a conduit for it. You build your life around it without even realizing it. Your creativity suffers. Not because you're not talented, but because addiction hijacks your attention. You're no longer able to hold the kind of deep focus real art demands. Your thoughts are scattered, fragmented, always anticipating the next hit. You begin to mistake stimulation for inspiration. And so the part of you that once reached for something greater, the transcendent, the meaningful, gets buried beneath 1,000 tiny distractions. Your relationships suffer too, not always in explosive ways. Sometimes they just decay. Your partner senses you're not fully there. Your friend wonders why your eyes glaze over mid-conversation. You say all the right things, but there's a void behind your words, a kind of emotional absenteeism. Because addiction doesn't just take your time, it takes your presence. And presence is the one thing you can't fake. People feel it, your absence, even when you smile, even when you show up. They feel that your soul is somewhere else, chasing something unseen, and slowly they start pulling back. Not in anger, but in quiet. But the most devastating consequence is the one you barely notice. You stop growing, not because you're weak, but because the very mechanism of addiction is anti-growth. It interrupts discomfort, the very soil from which evolution blooms. Every time you reach for the thing, you interrupt the cycle of expansion. Pain rises, an emotion, a wound, an unmet need, and instead of facing it, you numb it. You bypass the lesson. You skip the transformation. Over time, your emotional range shrinks. You become a shell of your potential, not dead, but not fully alive either. Somewhere in between, numb, efficient, functional. You become manageable for society, for others, even for yourself. But also disempowered. Because true power is forged in the furnace of discomfort, and addiction turns off the heat every time it starts to rise. This is why so many people feel like they're stuck, even if they have everything. They've anesthetized the very engine that drives transformation. Even more sinister is how society rewards this. We don't just tolerate addiction, we design around it. We turn it into business models. Our economy thrives on compulsive behavior. Binge watching, endless scrolling, one-click shopping, algorithmic dopamine loops. You're not weak for being addicted. You're targeted. Aldous Huxley foresaw this in Brave New World. He imagined a society where people didn't rebel because their oppression came wrapped in pleasure, a chemically managed peace, a synthetic joy. The death of meaning masked as convenience. In his words, the perfect dictatorship would have the appearance of democracy, but it would be a prison without walls, where the prisoners would not even dream of escaping. It would be a system of slavery where, through consumption and entertainment, the slaves would love their servitude. Sound familiar? Your addiction doesn't isolate you. It integrates you into a system that prefers you addicted, docile, distracted, dependent. And here lies the final, invisible consequence. Addiction turns you into someone predictable, and the more predictable you are, the easier you are to control. This is why your addiction isn't just personal, it's political. Every time you numb your inner voice, you become less capable of challenging the world around you, less likely to rebel, less likely to question, less likely to dream. You become another cog in the machine. Not because you agree with it, but because you're too tired to fight, too numb to care, too distracted to remember that you were born for something more than survival. So ask yourself, when was the last time you were truly awake? Not stimulated, not entertained, but fully, painfully, beautifully alive? When was the last time you sat in discomfort without needing to escape? When was the last time you looked at your compulsions and asked, "What are you hiding from me? What am I afraid to feel? Who might I become without you?" You don't need more motivation. You don't need more discipline. What you need is truth. And the truth is this: addiction doesn't just rob you of peace, it robs you of possibility, of becoming. The version of yourself that only suffering could unlock, if only you were brave enough to face it. But what if you could face it? What if there was a way out, not by suppressing the addiction, but by rewriting the story that created it? Let's step into the fire, not to burn, but to be reborn. You don't break an addiction by cutting it out. You break it by reclaiming what it replaced. Not the substance, not the screen, not the obsession, but the lost connection to self, to presence, to purpose. You see, addiction doesn't just feed on pain, it feeds on disconnection. from your body, from your truth, from the quiet voice you've learned to silence. It grows in the gaps, between what you feel and what you allow yourself to feel, between who you are and who you pretend to be. And so the first rebellion is not action. It is attention. It's learning to watch the craving rise without immediately obeying it, to observe the discomfort like a storm, powerful, temporary, survivable, to sit in it, not to suffer, but to listen, because every addiction carries a message. That drink, it says, I need relief, but I don't know how to ask. That scrolling, it whispers, I'm afraid of my own stillness. That compulsive relationship, it cries, I'm starving for connection, but terrified of rejection. But you never hear the message because the addiction drowns it out. You react before the words have formed. So the act of sitting, breathing, feeling, watching is not passive. It is revolutionary. You are interrupting a ritual that has ruled you. You are turning inward instead of outward. And in that moment, the identity begins to crack. This is where Jung's greatest insight returns. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life, and you will call it fate. The craving is not fate. The pain is not fate. The lie that you are broken, that this is who you will always be, is not fate. It is unconscious pattern. It is survival mode memory. It is software, not self. And once seen clearly, it can be rewritten. But this rewrite requires sacrifice, not of pleasure, not of comfort, but of who you think you are. This is where most people turn back, because transformation doesn't ask for improvement. It asks for death. The death of the false self. The one who needs the addiction to feel okay. The one who says, this is just who I am. You are not that story. You are the author who forgot they were writing. And the rebellion is remembering your pen. Look at the world around you. How many lie half asleep? Not because they want to, but because waking up hurts. Because reality, unfiltered, is sharp. But it is also alive. And that's what addiction steals from you, your aliveness. It numbs the pain, yes, but it also numbs the joy, the awe, the depth, the sacred ache of being fully human. To reclaim yourself, you must walk back into the fire you've spent years avoiding, but this time, you don't go in alone. You bring the light of awareness with you.
This is not about willpower. It is about truth. And the truth is this. You do not need to fight your addiction. You need to understand it. Not excuse it. Not justify it. But see it for what it actually is. A distorted answer to a forgotten question. That question may be, where did I lose myself? When did I learn I was unworthy of peace? Who taught me I had to earn my right to exist? The answer will not come in one day. But the asking, the courage to ask. That's the first step to becoming someone new. And as you walk this path, something strange begins to happen. The cravings lose their grip not because they disappear, but because you stop mistaking them for commands. You learn to hold space for the storm. You learn to feel without fleeing. You learn that you can survive what once seemed unbearable. And in that survival, a new identity is born. One that isn't built on avoidance, but on truth. One that doesn't need masks or performances. One that doesn't confuse addiction with personality. You start to remember what it felt like to be whole. To be still. To be unarmored. To be you, unedited. Not perfect. Not cured. But honest. That honesty is rare. Terrifying. Liberating. Because once you've tasted it, you can't go back. Not fully. Not without grieving what you're giving up. But in that grief, something else arises. Compassion. Not for the addiction, but for the self that needed it. You see the little child inside you who reached for anything just to feel safe. You see the teenager who numbed to avoid humiliation. You see the adult who carried pain in silence because the world never made space for it. And finally, you say to them, I see you now. You don't have to run anymore. We're going to do this differently. This is where the real healing begins. Not with self-discipline, but with self-relationship. You begin to live in alignment not with who you were told to be, but with who you actually are. You rediscover what makes you feel alive, not just distracted. You choose discomfort when it leads to truth. You choose silence when it leads to clarity. You choose love especially for the parts of you that never got it before. And then, one day, you notice something odd. You don't miss the old rituals. Not because they weren't powerful, but because you no longer need them to feel real. You've outgrown the identity. You've become the person addiction pretended to be. And this right here is the final, most powerful realization. You were never addicted to the substance. You were addicted to the absence of yourself. And now, you're coming home.